Welcome to the We're Doing It Wrong podcast, brought to you by Joseph Pizar and David Michael Slater. Today we bring you one of our favorite articles, Righting a Wrong, by Corbett Harrison. He's a writing guru and host of the wildly popular Always Right website. And then we'll include a bit of commentary at the end. He writes, "On the day I began middle school, I thought I was a decent writer. Before that first week ended, I vowed never to write about anything personal again. I stuck to that vow for 5 years. And now that I'm almost 50 and a person who still writes every day, I think a lot about those formative years when I suddenly detested writing. I often question whether I might be a stronger writer today if that one teacher, consciously or not, hadn't turned me against something I loved doing." Mr. Berea had been my teacher during my final 2 years of elementary. He was the first teacher to read one of my stories aloud to the whole class, and he ended up doing this a lot, which really surprised me. I didn't think of myself as a writer until once Mr. Berea laughed so hard while sharing my story that he actually teared up. I tell my students that Mr. Berea was the first teacher I ever made cry. Then I pause for a silent count of 3, adding, "Unfortunately, he wasn't the last teacher I ever made cry." And then I always get a good laugh. And I chuckle like it's the very first time I've ever delivered that perfectly placed joke in the middle of that particular story. Mr. Berea taught me valuable writing tricks. From him, I learned to hide well-timed moments of humor inside my stories. He also taught me the power of planning a pause in writing. Humor was simply funnier when you wrote a pause before the punch. And most impressively, he knew to stress the same words I would have stressed when he read my stories back to me. But how did he know? I asked him once, and he said, "I'm just reading it with the voice that you gave it." I entered middle school in September of 1980, ready to become a more mature writer. That first day in English class, my teacher assigned us an overnight essay. Maybe she called it a theme, but anyway, I approved of her topic. It was something like, "Teach me about you by sharing the story of a relationship you have with a person who cares about you." To me, that sounded like a mature approach to writing. Write about me, but do it through someone else's story. I had been ripening as a storyteller for 12 long years, and I was about to impress this teacher enough to someday read my stories aloud to her class. I certainly had a mature idea for this topic. My mother's addiction issues, and how I contributed to them. Truth be told, since we're all friends here, Mom hadn't had it easy. After I was born, our dad left her alone with 3 young boys to raise. We had a house, but hardly any money. I'm the youngest and the one with the fuzziest memories of then. But we definitely were challenging children. I don't hold it against my mom that she found escape from us boys after long, long days. She became addicted to chocolate. It was her best escape then and still is today. Unfortunately, when the money's tight and one lives with 3 young boys, all purchased chocolate disappears quickly unless it's hidden. Our mom started concealing half-eaten bags of semi-sweet chocolate chips throughout the house. When she needed a fix, she'd disappear for a few minutes and return moments later with amazing breath. We didn't take long to discover her caches. And for the rest of my childhood, we played a wonderful game as a family. Find Mom's chocolate. She played too, and her hiding places grew more and more skillful over time. I can't say the same for her memory. One summer, she completely forgot that she'd hidden a fresh bag of chocolate chips in the glove compartment of our 1971 Volkswagen van. And when we found it weeks later, we carried it into the kitchen, peeling off its yellow plastic covering like a banana peel, and we broke the brick into bite-sized pieces using an ice pick and a wooden kitchen mallet, and we laughed and we loved each other. That was the story I wrote for my first middle school English teacher when I was 12, and I received a big red D- on it the very next day, a 64%. And at this point in telling this story as a keynote, I pause, appreciating the predictable sigh from my audience comprised of fellow teachers, followed by their shaking of heads and whispers, I have a fantasy that someday an old teacher will stand up and self-identify to the group I'm telling this story to. That was me. I'm sorry, and I wasn't fair. But that's not happened yet. To be fair, my teacher, she had told us she would be marking off 4 percentage points for every single spelling error, which, despite how silly that sounds to me as criteria for grading, I probably should have paid better attention to her because I was her student. Unfortunately, I became too lost in the telling of my story to notice that I had misspelled the word chocolate 9 times. 9 times. That stupid O in the middle of chocolate? Who knew? And just to be crystal clear here, I earned my D for misspelling the same word 9 different times. That middle school teacher taught me 2 things. 1, how to spell the word chocolate. And 2, writing with truth and heart is much less valued than writing with conventional correctness. I was hurt enough by this lesson to completely stop writing. Does hurting students through arbitrary grading ever instruct? As a teacher with almost 30 years under his belt, I know that I, too, have hurt students by leaving marks and making honest commentary about their personal writing. Writing, even when it's not a personal topic, requires a personal process. I must provide a huge amount of feedback in a way that helps instead of harms, and I've made mistakes. Forever, I've wished there was a way my students could simply write without letting the future letter grade interfere with their process. Well, writers' notebooks have become a tool that allow my students to write without fear of their own ideas being evaluated. My classroom makes solid use of what Ralph Fletcher and Amy Bucker have called writers' notebooks. For 10 minutes every day, my students are themselves through a piece of writing that lives in those notebooks. Some students ramble for 10 minutes every day, some wax poetically, some create lists, and some try to amuse themselves or their neighbors with their writing, and some spend their 10 daily minutes writing a continuing draft of a first novel. I do not grade the notebook's writing, not for spelling, not for punctuation, not for anything other than students participating fully for the 10 minutes by adding to their notebook. Of course, many students struggle with starting a notebook at the beginning. Most have never been asked to simply sit, open a notebook, and practice fluency while letting their original ideas and thoughts plop onto pages. On the first day, most can write about 2 minutes before exhausting themselves. So like a musician or athlete, we practice. 6 weeks in, thanks to scaffolding tools and a teacher who models his own notebook strategies, 10 minutes of writing are no longer enough time. My students beg for more. I don't have much extra time to spare because, like other teachers, I have to teach many mandated writing formats to my students. It's part of our curriculum, and even though it's not the exciting part of writing, I teach it. Between dry writing lessons, my students visit their writer's notebooks. There, they do not worry about formulaic sentence patterns and spelling words. They simply enjoy the writing process. In August of 2009, I launched my first writer's notebook routine with all of my classes. These last 8 years of a pretty long career as a writing teacher have never been more enjoyable. My students' notebooks hatch more original ideas than any tool I've ever asked them to use in class before. I've given my students, even those who struggle, what Mr. Berea once gave me, a belief I have truth to share despite an occasional misspelling. I think of this story and the impact that the grade had on Corbett Harrison as a 12-year-old student. And as a teacher myself, I can't help but ask myself, how does my feedback influence my students? Is it constructive feedback? Is it arbitrary? How am I grading my assignments? And I think it begs the question, do our grading practices reflect what matters about our content? What makes our content worth learning about? So I think about writing and I think about math, and I teach math. What makes those content areas worth learning about? Well, in math, I believe the reason anyone tends to enjoy math is actually understanding the concepts. That's the part that makes math fun. Figuring out the puzzle, figuring out the system of philosophy that underlies the concepts and system of math, and making those connections. That's what makes math worth learning about. So if when I teach math and when I grade math, all I care about are the conventions, and if I weight too heavily, even things like calculations, sometimes we undercut those things that make the content worth learning about. Now, to be clear, students have to be able to compute accurately, but we have to be assessing and grading on their conceptual knowledge and promoting that in every way, every day in our classrooms, because that's what actually makes the content matter to students. It's what makes it fun to learn. I think about writing. Writing's a very personal process, and it allows for a great deal of innovation, especially if the assignment's open and they have a lot of flexibility. So what matters there? Well, it's the content of their ideas. It's the ability to really create something anew from scratch, from your own thoughts, your own experiences, put it on a piece of paper, and it can serve many purposes. There's an excitement to know that others might read it. For some, it might just be a therapeutic process. Just the actual process of writing provides some therapeutic joy to us as individuals. I strongly believe that. In fact, I believe some people get that from doing math, just thinking about math, thinking about numeration, thinking about concepts, even of the most simple math. Fraction addition is an example that I've seen some students just ponder and really dig deep into how things are working and gain a level of enjoyment and conceptual understanding that makes them feel accomplished. So as teachers, when we move forward, I think it's wise of us to ask, number one, what makes our class worth coming to every day? And it can't be just the fun, frivolous things. What about the content makes it worth learning about? And then, do we weight that in our grading system? It's a great reflective question, I think, that all of us should be asking regularly. How are we promoting what matters most about our content through grading? And then how are we attending to those details that might be a bit annoying to some students, to a lot of students, that are important, but they're only important insofar as they make what matters work. So spelling's important and conventions are important because it makes the content of the idea accessible to other people. Calculation's absolutely important because it's the outcome of a system of numeration and logic. So 2 plus 2 is actually 4. That's the only thing that 2 plus 2 is. But it works that way because of the nature of the concept of 2, the nature of the concept of addition. And when you combine those two concepts, you end up with a concept of 4. So all those things about math, about writing, about reading, we have to dig deep. Science, social studies, what actually makes that worth learning about? How do we weight it with our grades? And then when we give feedback, do we communicate this idea that there are things about our classes don't necessarily matter as much, but we have to do them because if we don't, it obfuscates what does matter. How do we communicate that to students? I think it's a good question for us all to ponder. And with that, let's turn the page.